One of the most infamous and influential occult figures of the early 20th century was none other than Aleister Crowley, an English magician, writer, and mountaineer. He styled himself as the prophet of a new spiritual era, willingly embracing the title of the Beast 666. In his lifetime, he gained notoriety for transgressive and rather decadent behavior, earning tabloid epithets like the wickedest man in the world. Yet Crowley was a bit more than just that. He was a prolific author, an intellectual explorer, going into mysticism, yoga, magical rites, and esoteric philosophy with the zeal of a scholar and, of course, the showmanship of a provocateur. We're going to talk about Crowley's journey, from his strict religious upbringing in Victorian England to his final days in relative obscurity. And we'll look at both the famous chapters of his occult career, such as his work with the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the founding of new magical orders like the AA and Ordo Templi Orientis, and the revelation of his religion Thelema. But then we'll look at the lesser-known but significant facets of his life, the mountaineering expeditions, worldwide travels, the relationships, the books, the scandals, and even a few other surprising details that make the story just that little bit more compelling. So, if you would come with me, then we can journey into the life of Aleister Crowley together. Now, allow me to welcome you to the channel first. It is good manners to do so. If you're new here or you're yet to click that subscribe button, I invite you to do so if you feel inclined. Now, this video, along with all of the videos on this channel, you can look at the playlists for them, are completely ad-free. You won't get interrupted. Listen to it all the way through. No problems. Well, this is due to the generous contributions of those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, those who looked at the merch store even out of a bit of curiosity, and those who gave the occasional donation, whether that's through Super Thanks or on PayPal. So we have them to thank for that. If you would like to join that prestigious club, you need only look in the pinned comment or in the video description or channel description. You'll find where you need to go. Now, with all this out of the way and introduction said and done in keeping with our theme of good manners, let us begin, nice and slow, the life of Aleister Crowley. Edward Alexander Crowley, born on October 12, 1875, in Royal Leamington Spa, England. He entered the world into a well-off but intensely devout family, which is a little bit ironic. His father, Edward Crowley, had retired young on a sizable inheritance from the family brewing business and become a traveling evangelist for a fundamentalist Christian sect, the Exclusive Brethren, part of the Plymouth Brethren movement. Every day of Crowley's childhood began with his father reading a chapter from the Bible at breakfast. Crowley's mother, Emily Bertha Bishop, was equally as pious. It was a strict Christian upbringing in the Victorian sense, and the young Crowley initially idolized his father, later recalling him fondly as my hero and my friend. Now, this idealized view of his father would clash with the harsh religious discipline he experienced after his father's premature death, creating the first of many inner contradictions within Crowley's life. You'll see what I mean as we go on. Well, when Crowley was just 11 years old, his father died of cancer, March 1887. Such a loss was a turning point for the young Aleister. Without his father's tempering influence, Crowley began to rebel against the narrow brethren morality that surrounded him. He was sent to a series of religious boarding schools, and he hated them all. One headmaster in Hastings was so strict and sadistic in his punishments that Crowley would later describe him as a sadist, and blamed him for instilling a hatred of religious hypocrisy. The young Crowley reacted to this environment by gleefully flouting the rules of piety. He smoked cigars, consumed alcohol, explored his sexuality, all considered grave sins in his family's creed. Well, by his early teens, he had already lost whatever faith he had left in Christianity. In fact, so dramatic was his rejection of his mother's fundamentalism that in exasperation she began calling him the Beast, with reference to the Antichrist in the book of Revelation. But rather than being offended, Crowley embraced the nickname and the transgressive identity that it implied. He would later adopt the title the Beast 666 as a personal moniker, partly in mockery of Christian fears, and partly as an expression of his self-image as a figure meant to overturn that old, rigid religious order. Crowley's academic path in these years was quite erratic. He bounced between schools, Malvern College and Tunbridge School among them, until finally his family provided a private tutor and allowed him more freedom in Eastbourne. Free from an oppressive school environment, Crowley thrived in his own unconventional way. He had developed keen interests in chess, poetry, and mountain climbing, and by the age of 16, he had become an adept climber of the seaside cliffs at Beachy Head, and even the peaks of the Alps during summer holidays. What were you doing at 16? It's pretty impressive, I think. But he also acquired his first exposure to skeptical and occult literature. Crowley had later recounted a formative mystical experience during a trip to Stockholm in December of 1896 at age 21, which he believed awakened him to a different spiritual reality. Biographers have speculated that this experience may have coincided with Crowley's first sexual encounter with a man, a realization of his bisexual identity that further estranged him from the Victorian norms. Of course, back then you get thrown in jail for that sort of stuff. But whatever the exact trigger, by the time he left adolescence behind, Crowley was intellectually precocious, contemptuous of conventional religion, and all in all, very eager to carve out a unique path in life. Now, of course, back in those days, most people were more keen to fit into the narrative, but Crowley was the complete opposite. In October of 1895, he entered Trinity College, part of the University of Cambridge, ostensibly to study the moral sciences, i.e. philosophy. But in practice, he treated his Cambridge years as a gentleman's education in the broadest sense, indulging in all the pursuits that interested him. Almost immediately he abandoned the prescribed curriculum and switched to English literature, a subject not formally examined at Cambridge at the time, but which he pursued with his tutor's blessing. Crowley read widely in poetry and classics. He was especially influenced by romantic poets like Percy Bysshe Shelley, and by the explorer literati like Sir Richard Burton. He also became president of the university's chess club, seriously contemplating a career as a professional chess master due to his genuine talent of the game. But perhaps the most fateful development of his university life was his increasing fascination with the occult and esoteric thought. Crowley began to seek out books on magic and mysticism, at one point obtaining a copy of The Book of Black Magics and Pacts by A.E. Waite, that is Arthur Edward Waite, by the way, and the mystical Christian text The Cloud upon the Sanctuary. These works hinted at hidden realms of spiritual knowledge beyond the material world, and that was certainly a prospect that deeply resonated with him. It was during this period that Crowley made a deliberate decision to remake his own identity. Dissatisfied with his birth name, Edward, and the familial nickname, Alec, which he found ugly, he chose to rename himself Aleister. As he later explained in his confessional autobiography, he wanted a name that would become famous, and Aleister Crowley had a commanding, poetic rhythm. A dactyl followed by a spondy in poetic terms, if you caught it. Well, that satisfied his romantic imagination. The choice also distanced him from his mother's habit of calling him Alec. Thus, by his early 20s, the young man was already authoring himself as a character set apart from the norm. Published his first poems, some in student literary magazines, under the name Aleister Crowley. A collection of decadent and erotic poetry titled White Stains was printed abroad in 1898 to avoid British censorship, giving a foretaste of the scandalous reputation he was starting to cultivate. Crowley's Cambridge sojourn ended rather unceremoniously. In 1898, after 3 years, he left the university without completing a degree. He had, however, inherited a substantial fortune upon coming of age, the legacy from the family brewing enterprise, which meant he was financially independent and free to pursue his own interests without needing a conventional career. This freedom turned out to be a double-edged sword. It enabled Crowley to travel, study, and write as he pleased, but it also insulated him from the moderating effects of any regular professional responsibility. As a flamboyant, self-assured young man with a sizable bank account and a chip on his shoulder against Christian morality, Aleister Crowley was now poised to dive headlong into the occult underworld of London at the turn of the century. Crowley's time at Cambridge had broadened his intellectual horizons and seemingly unshackled him from the last vestiges of his brethren upbringing. It was during these university years that he experienced what considered his awakening to that world of the occult. A key factor was his encounter with the like-minded individuals he came across, and literature that catered to his curiosity about magic and the unseen. By 1897, Crowley was performing his first simple magic rituals and testing his willpower through various exercises. He also had a bit of a brief romantic relationship with another bloke, Herbert Charles Polet. He was actually the president of the Cambridge Footlights Drama Club, and this affair is quite noteworthy, not only for revealing Crowley's bisexuality, but also for highlighting a divergence in his life's direction. Polet had no interest in occultism, and Crowley ultimately chose the occult over the relationship, a decision he said he later regretted, but felt was necessary for his true calling. Well, as Crowley's interest in mysticism deepened, he read broadly on the subject, read broadly. Well, he was drawn to the idea of contacting spirit realms and mastering secret knowledge. I mean, it sounds pretty interesting, doesn't it? Who could say no to that? So, in March 1898, Crowley acquired 2 books that profoundly influenced him, that is, Waite's Book of Black Magic and the aforementioned The Cloud Upon the Sanctuary. These works hinted that behind exoteric religion lay an esoteric core accessible only to those who were truly initiated. Crowley believed there existed a hidden masters or secret chiefs who could guide the spiritual evolution of humankind, ideas he would later carry into his own magical philosophy. The young man's sense of destiny was stoked by such readings. He started to view himself as someone who might penetrate the true mysteries of life. A chance meeting in the summer of 1898 set the stage for Crowley's formal entry into an occult order. While vacationing in Switzerland, climbing in the Alps, as was his natural annual habit, Crowley met a chemist named Julian L. Baker. Well, after a bit of talking, they discovered they shared a fascination with alchemy and esoteric subjects. Baker, as it happened, was a member of an occult fraternity in London known as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. It was through Baker that Crowley learned of this society, which claimed to teach the secrets of ceremonial magic and spiritual illumination. Baker introduced him to another member, George Cecil Jones. Jones would later become a lifelong friend and an important figure in Crowley's development, guiding him gently into the order's fold. In late 1898, armed with introductions, Aleister Crowley was accepted into the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He was initiated on November 18, 1898, taking the magical motto Frata Perdurabo, which is Latin for I will endure till the end. The Golden Dawn at the time was the preeminent occult organization in Britain, boasting a membership that included scholars, poets, and aristocrats, the place to be for anyone interested in the topic. Founded a decade earlier, it structured its teachings in graded levels, combining elements of Kabbalah, astrology, tarot, Enochian magic, and Rosicrucian symbolism. But for Crowley, joining the order was like stepping into the very world of hidden knowledge that he had craved. He excelled in learning ritual techniques and memorizing arcane correspondences, diving right in. In a short time, he advanced through the order's ranks. However, Crowley's personality and his lifestyle quickly generated more than a bit of friction within the order. While they were tolerant of creative eccentrics, they still operated within a veneer of this Edwardian propriety. Crowley, by contrast, was openly bisexual, lived lavishly, and showed very little respect for the social niceties. He installed himself in a luxurious London flat on Chancery Lane and decorated it with occult regalia. To further his studies, he even invited a senior Golden Dawn mage, Alan Bennett, to live with him as a personal tutor. Bennett, a brilliant ritualist who struggled with ill health, introduced Crowley to advanced ceremonial magic and the use of psychoactive drugs in a ritual setting. The two performed invocations from the Goetia in Crowley's apartment, Goetia, of course, being a kind of grimoire of spirit evocation. Well, they enveloped themselves in incense smoke too, and perhaps used opiates or hashish to heighten the trance states. I'm sure it worked well enough. Well, these intense experiments gave Crowley a taste of mystical ecstasy and the feeling of tangible interactions with spiritual entities. Alan Bennett's influence on Crowley was profound but short-lived. By 1899, Bennett had departed for South Asia to pursue Buddhism, leaving Crowley with a broadened perspective that integrated Eastern spirituality. We're talking yoga, meditation techniques, this kind of thing, all mixed together with the Western ceremonial practice. Meanwhile, Crowley continued to offend other Golden Dawn members with his behavior. He had feuds with prominent members, most famously the poet W.B. Yeats, who had found Crowley insufferable. Additionally, rumors about Crowley's libertine activities, including his sexual liaisons regarded as unnatural in that era, spread in the tight-knit occult community. People were talking, and they were not saying kind things. The Golden Dawn wasn't a monolith. It was already suffering internal schisms. The group's London leadership had grown distrustful of the order's co-founder, Samuel Little MacGregor Mathers, who was issuing directives from Paris as the organization's nominal head. Crowley, eager for advancement, sided with Mathers. In early 1900, when the London Lodge refused to initiate Crowley into the inner Second Order, citing his reputation and unsavory habits, Crowley appealed directly to Mathers. Mathers, who saw in Crowley a useful ally against the London rebels, agreed to initiate him in Paris, and even sent him on an interesting mission to assert Mathers' authority by seizing the Golden Dawn's initiation temple space in London. Thus occurred one of the more dramatic and, I suppose, a little bit of a comical episode of Crowley's early occult career. It was known as the Battle of Blythe Road. In April of 1900, Crowley showed up at the Golden Dawn's London Temple on Blythe Road, West Kensington, dressed in a flamboyant Highland Scots regalia, complete with a kilt and dagger, claiming to be Mathers' representative and demanding control of the temple premises. He was accompanied by his mistress at the time, Elaine Simpson, who was also a Golden Dawn initiate. The members in London, including Yeats, refused to accede to his demands. The confrontation between a legal matter became a legal matter and went to court. Unsurprisingly, the judge ruled in favor of the London Lodge members, who held the lease to the property, all the paperwork in order, and all the rest. Well, Crowley's attempted coup had failed. He and Mathers were effectively ousted from the Order's activities, and the Golden Dawn soon splintered apart from these disputes. The golden days over. And Crowley, well, he had gained a taste of infamy from the affair. Newspapers got wind of the occult squabble, and he did not discourage the sensationalist press coverage. In later years, he even took a certain pride in having helped expose the Golden Dawn's secrets. And perhaps the episode was a catalyst that freed him to establish his own esoteric path. Well, certainly a turbulent initiation, don't you think? But it taught Crowley an important lesson. He learned that formal organizations could be restrictive and prone to politics. His independent streak thus deepened. He also learned that scandal could burnish his notoriety. He also played up the image of the dangerous sorcerer in the public eye. He noticed it attracted curiosity to his circle and the occasional willing disciple. But most importantly, Crowley emerged from the Golden Dawn debacle with confidence that he had mastered the basics of ceremonial magic. He believed he was ready to push further than his former peers ever dared, and, with his substantial inheritance still fueling his ventures, Crowley embarked on several years of global travel and intensive magical experimentation that would both establish and test his limits. In the aftermath of the Golden Dawn collapse, Crowley turned away from London's occult scene and journeyed abroad to seek wisdom, adventure, and perhaps a little occult insight. Well, he more or less spent the years 1900 to 903 as a wandering seeker. During this period, he also engaged in some of the most impressive and hazardous mountaineering exploits of his life, a facet often overshadowed by his occult fame, by the way. That's why the video's 2 hours long, as we have to talk about the little parts, don't we? So in 1900, Crowley set sail for America and beyond. He first traveled to Mexico, arriving in Mexico City, where he lived for several months. In Mexico, he claimed to have been initiated into a local Masonic lodge, which he took as a kind of validation of his esoteric credentials, though later scrutiny is cast out on the legitimacy of his Mexican Freemasonry experience. But more tangibly, he pursued both his magical practice and climbing passion. Mexico's volcanoes were his training ground. Sounds very safe. Crowley was joined by his climbing friend Oscar Eckenstein, ascended notable peaks such as Popocatépetl. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that, but... Well, they even made an ambitious attempt at Colima, an active volcano which was thwarted by eruptions. During quiet periods in Mexico, Crowley experimented with the Enochian magical system, originally developed by Elizabethan magus John Dee, and he wrote poetry and plays, including one based on Wagner's opera Tannhauser. This mixing of strenuous outdoor adventure with mystical practice was pretty characteristic of Crowley. He sought to integrate the physical and spiritual, testing himself both in thin mountain air and the depths of trance. After Mexico, Crowley passed through San Francisco and Hawaii, then ventured to Asia. By late 1901 and 1902, he was in Ceylon, which is the modern country of Sri Lanka, and then moved to India. It was in Ceylon that he reunited with his old mentor. Remember Alan Bennett? Well, he had become a Buddhist monk at this time. Under Bennett's guidance, Crowley took a deep dive into Hindu and Buddhist meditation techniques. He devoted himself to Raja Yoga, practicing intense concentration exercises and breath control. According to Crowley's diaries, he attained states of dhyana, that is, meditative absorption, during this retreat. These Eastern practices profoundly influenced his magical philosophy, convincing him that enlightenment could be systematically pursued. It was in Ceylon that Crowley encountered the concept of the holy guardian angel, a personal divine genius that he would later make central to his teachings. The two occultists, Bennett and Crowley, eventually parted ways as Bennett traveled on to Burma to pursue Buddhism full-time, while Crowley's destiny lay back in the West. But Crowley carried a lifelong respect for Buddhism and yoga, often framing his own system as a marriage of Eastern and Western mysticism with Western ritual. Well, in 1902, Crowley's focus shifted back to mountaineering. That year he led an expedition at what would become legendary in climbing history, an attempt to summit K2 in the Himalayas. Not an easy climb, by the way. At 28,251 feet, K2 is the second highest mountain in the world, and was at that time unclimbed. Crowley and Oscar Eckenstein had begun planning this endeavor since their Mexican climbs. They assembled an international team, including a young Cambridge student named Guy Knowles, two seasoned Austrian climbers, and a Swiss doctor, Jules Jacques Guillemot. The expedition, which set out in the spring of 1902 from British India, now Pakistani territory, was beset with difficulties from the outset. British authorities briefly arrested Eckenstein on baseless suspicion to stop the climb, possibly due to his prior socialist activism. Didn't win you any friends back in those days. But regardless, the team pushed on. Crowley took charge during Eckenstein's absence and demonstrated both his logistical talent and rather abrasive style of leadership. He insisted on bringing along a trunk full of books and poetry, declaring that, quote, he could not have stood on the Baltoro Glacier in the absence of Milton, even as arguments brewed about the load weight. I'm sure he didn't carry it himself. Well, trekking through the rugged Baltistan, Crowley soon quarreled with colleagues and porters alike. The journey through steep passes and across roaring glacial rivers tested everybody's endurance. Crowley himself suffered bouts of malaria, influenza, and snow blindness during the climb. But remarkably, the team managed to reach about 18,600 feet on K2, which was a record at the time for human climbing. But internal strife and bad weather ended the attempt before the summit. Crowley's relationship with the others deteriorated sharply high on the mountain. At one camp, nearly 7,000 meters up, Guy Knowles challenged Crowley's decisions, and in a surreal moment, Crowley responded by pulling out a revolver, pointing it at the man and demanding his obedience. Well, the thin air of K2 had only exacerbated Crowley's authoritarian streak. Eventually, facing storms, illness, and dwindling supplies, the expedition turned back. It was a glorious failure, in retrospect. They proved such altitudes, perhaps not the attitudes, could be endured for weeks, laying groundwork for future K2 expeditions. I mean, the new people coming basically say, well, Crowley and his crew got up to about 18,000 feet, so why can't we? In any case, Crowley's abrasive conduct, culminating in the pistol incident, circulated in mountaineering circles, and it reinforced his reputation as brilliant but dangerously erratic. Pushing limits again in 1905, Crowley joined another major Himalayan expedition, this time to Kanchenjunga in Nepal, the world's third highest peak, by the way. Everyone always knows about Everest and K2, but they never talk about Kanchenjunga. Well, at least outside of mountaineering circles. He was invited by Dr. Jacob Guillemal from the K2 team. Crowley couldn't resist the challenge of another unclimbed giant. But he did stipulate, however, that he would be the absolute leader, a condition that caused Oscar Eckenstein and others to bow out, citing Crowley's volatility. Well, I don't blame them after that pistol incident, that's for sure. No one wants one of them pointed at their heads, especially not at the top of a mountain. Well, in August 1905, Crowley's party, including Guillemot and 2 experienced Swiss climbers, set out from Darjeeling with hundreds of porters and enormous supplies. But from the beginning, things were not going well. Crowley was in high spirits at the start. His diary records exultation at the clear views and his own robust health at 15,000 feet. But his companions soon regarded his leadership as reckless. He pushed ahead, despite Porter's misgivings about the, quote, sacred mountain, and despite inadequate equipment. Many of the porters lacked proper boots in the icy terrain. Proper footwear, of course, you don't go hiking without that, even on solid ground. Well, disputes erupted over Crowley's harsh treatments of the porters and his dictatorial style. Matters came to a head when a porter's fatal fall amid ominous avalanche conditions caused most of the team to mutiny. They voted to depose Crowley and descend to safer camps. Crowley flatly refused to cooperate or relinquish command, effectively isolating himself at the high camp. What followed was nothing short of a tragedy. As the dissenting climbers attempted to retreat at night against Crowley's warnings, an avalanche swept away one of the rope teams. 4 men were killed: Alexis Pache, one of the climbers, and 3 porters. Crowley, who remained in his tent at 21,000 feet during the emergency, claimed that he did not hear the disaster until it was too late. In the morning, he coolly walked past the traumatized survivors, refusing to help search for the bodies, and just continued down the mountain alone. Pretty callous behavior, right? Well, it certainly shocked and enraged his teammates. Back in civilization, Crowley made things worse by writing unapologetic press articles. He blamed the others for disobeying his instructions and suggested their incompetence led to their deaths, assertions that horrified the climbing community. Any friends he had left in that club were certainly gone. But while it's true that Crowley had advised against the nighttime descent, correctly predicting its danger, It was his lack of empathy and, I suppose, poor sportsmanship that really sealed his fate. The prestigious Alpine Club publicly distanced itself, noting Crowley had never been one of their members and implicitly disavowing his conduct. One could say that the whole affair marked the end of his mountaineering career, but it left him with a kind of spiritual scar. Decades later, in the throes of heroin addiction, Crowley admitted to nightmarish hallucinations, and he actually called them the Kanchenjunga phobia, as if ghosts from the sacred peak were haunting him. This was one arena where Crowley's willpower and luck had failed to triumph, and it resulted in a very real human cost. Throughout these expeditions, Crowley interwove adventure with moments of spiritual work. Between climbs in India and across Asia, he continued performing rituals and writing. In 1903, after the Kanchenjunga disaster, he retreated to Calcutta and Rangoon to recover from stress and illness, including a bout of malaria. And this was a somber period. He learned that his infant daughter, Lilith, had died of illness back in Rangoon while Crowley was away climbing. The death of his firstborn child hit Crowley hard, and also hastened the disintegration of his marriage, as we shall see shortly. He briefly took solace in distractions, big game hunting in the Bengali forests, and even an incident in which he survived an armed mugging attempt by shooting and wounding his attackers in self-defense. Such exploits reinforced Crowley's self-image as someone under magical protection or destiny, escaping scraps that might kill a mere ordinary man. In any case, by the end of 1903, Crowley's life had become a tapestry of extraordinary threads. He had tasted both triumph and failure on the highest mountains, looked into Eastern mysticism, and tested his magical prowess in solitude. But unbeknownst to him, all of these experiences were preparing him for the most pivotal event of his occult career, which was about to unfold in an unlikely setting, a Cairo apartment in 1904, where he would receive the text that became the scripture of his brand new religion. In 1904, Crowley underwent a profound spiritual and creative breakthrough, and it would define the rest of his life. This was the year that he received the Book of the Law, the foundational text of the religious philosophy that he named Thelema. Now, he didn't receive it as in going to a store and buying it or someone giving it to him. You see, the circumstances surrounding this revelation are among the most famous episodes in occult history, and Crowley himself, ever the storyteller, left details, if at times inconsistent accounts of what actually transpired. The saga began with an impulsive marriage. In August of 1903, Crowley had married Rose Edith Kelly, the sister of his artist friend Gerald Kelly. The marriage initially was one of convenience. Rose was facing an undesirable arranged marriage, and Crowley gallantly, if stupidly, stepped in to wed her so she could escape from that fate. But he was not in love with Rose at first. In fact, he had to reassure her family that the match was respectable. However, during an extended honeymoon tour through Paris, Naples, and eventually Cairo, Crowley found himself becoming a lot closer with his wife and, well, eventually falling in love with her quite deeply. He wrote tender love poems to Rose, compiled later in a collection titled Rosa Mundi. And Rose, for her part, began as a fairly conventional English woman with no particular occult interests. Of course, that would change dramatically once they reached Egypt. By early 1904, the Crowleys were living in Cairo, living in a rented apartment. Ever theatrical, Crowley informed locals that he and Rose were Prince and Princess Kyoa Khan, an exotic claim that proved them to be a certain cachet. Crowley transformed their apartment to a makeshift temple room, surrounded by statuary and ancient Egyptian artifacts. He began to invoke Egyptian deities as part of his ongoing magical experiments. Initially, Crowley was somewhat dismissive of Rose's spiritual sensitivity. She showed signs of entering light trances, which he attributed to her drinking or just, whimsy in general. But it was soon after that he had to take her seriously. In a series of strange episodes in March 1904, Rose repeatedly told Crowley, in some sort of delirium, "They are waiting for you." Well, the obvious question that Crowley had asked her was, "Who are they?" And Rose, with growing certainty, answered that it was none other than the god Horus, trying to get Crowley's attention. To test Rose's sudden mystical proclamation, Crowley brought her to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and in a famous scene, Rose led him directly to a particular museum exhibit, a painted wooden funerary stele from the 26th dynasty. On this artifact, known as the Stele of Ankh-Fn-Khonsu, Crowley was astonished to see the images of the gods Horus in the form of Ra-Hor-Khuit and Nuit, and the text uncannily resonated with Rose's utterances. Even more striking, the exhibit was catalogued as number 666, the very number that Crowley had so identified with. You've seen the thumbnail. Well, he took this as an overwhelming omen, too many coincidences for it to be just that. Indeed, some kind of cosmic intelligence was at work, and he dubbed the artifact the Stele of Revealing. Following these portents, Crowley performed rituals to invoke Horus. On March 20th, 1904, during an invocation of the god, Rose, acting as a medium, announced that, quote, "the equinox of the gods has come," meaning that a new spiritual era was dawning. Then, on 3 consecutive days, April 8th, 9th, and 10th, Crowley experienced the central event. He heard the voice. As Crowley later described it, around noon on each of these days, he entered his study, and a disembodied voice over his left shoulder dictated a text to him. He wrote down everything he heard. The voice identified itself as Aiwas, the messenger of Horus, or more precisely, the manifestation of the god Hor-Pa-Krat. The transmissions lasted about an hour each day, resulting in 3 chapters of cryptic, poetic, and often eerily powerful verses. And when it was all over, Crowley possessed a manuscript that he titled Liber al-Vel Legis, meaning the Book of the Law. In the narrative of Crowley's life, this was a watershed equivalent to Moses receiving the tablets on Sinai, or Muhammad receiving the Quran in the cave, a direct revelation from a cosmic, otherworldly intelligence. The Book of the Law proclaimed that a new aeon of humanity had begun, the aeon of Horus. Its central teaching was encapsulated in the famous line, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." The text is rich with symbolism and quite revolutionary in tone. It's not too much to read either. It's a pretty short book, so I do advise you go and read it. Knock it off in, an hour or so, something like that. But it declares that each person has a unique true will or purpose, and that following this true inner calling is the supreme ethic. Love is the law, love under will. That's another key phrase, balancing the seeming permissiveness of absolute freedom with the alignment to one's deeper purpose. The book is also unambiguously casting Crowley in a prophetic role. It's quite convenient. He was chosen as the scribe and prophet of this new aeon, tasked to spread the law of Thelema. Now, Thelema, by the way, that is Greek for will. So, the will is the law, you know. But it would take Crowley years, even decades, to fully decipher and accept the implications of the Book of the Law. In the immediate aftermath, he reacted with a mix of astonishment, skepticism, and even a bit of defiance. The content of the revelation was a bit too radical, even for him at first, and so he shelved the manuscript almost entirely. Legend has it that he stuck it in a drawer and tried to forget about it. But he did carry one instruction from the text. He typed a few copies and sent them to some close occult friends, mostly to confused silence. Not the reaction he was hoping for, I suppose. But Crowley did not immediately fulfill the other commands from the books, such as taking that museum still and enshrining it, or publishing the book widely. In fact, he and Rose departed Cairo later in 1904, and moved on with their travels, with Liber Al largely ignored. Crowley's diaries from the period show him returning to more mundane matters. He wrote satirical essays like Why Jesus Wept, and continued to practice more magic without overtly invoking Thelema's tenets. Now, by the way, just quickly, Jesus wept in the Bible, that's actually the shortest verse of the Bible. This is going to help you out on trivia nights when that question comes up. Comes up on the chase all the time. I can't remember exactly where it might have been in Thessalonians, I'm not sure. I don't know. Well, in any case, it was only gradually, after some years, after dramatic shifts in his life, that Crowley fully embraced Thelema as his true life's mission. Nonetheless, the Cairo revelation marked a point of no return. Crowley would never again be just another magician or poet. He now bore the mantle, at least in his own mind, of a kind of prophet of a new age. But the experience also coincided with dramatic personal changes. Rose, who had acted as a conduit for the revelation, unfortunately descended into alcoholism in the subsequent years. The young couple welcomed their daughter in July, whom Crowley named with a flourish of occult significance, Nuit Ma Ahatur Hecate Sappho Jezebel Lilith. Yeah, and you thought Elon Musk's kids had strange names. Of course, they called her Lilith for short. But as we said, tragedy struck when Lilith died of illness in 1906, while Crowley and Rose were in Burma. Rose's grief and guilt fueled the drinking, and little by little, her relationship with Crowley deteriorated. Before these tragedies unfolded, though, Crowley in 1904-05 was testing how to live as the prophet of Thelema. He wrote commentaries on the Book of the Law, though often obliquely, as if to argue with it. The message, "Do what thou wilt," was not an invitation to unbridled hedonism in Crowley's interpretation, but rather a challenge to discover one's true purpose beyond the egoistic whims. But still, to conventional eyes it looked like pure blasphemy and self-indulgence, fuel for future scandal when it became public. At the time, Crowley kept it relatively private. He could scarcely imagine that decades later, "Do what thou wilt" would be famous or infamous, far beyond occult circles. Well, for now, as 1904 ended, Crowley was the man who had climbed mountains and plumbed deep mystical states, received a holy book from a voice in the air, and yet he still had no organized following or framework to disseminate these teachings. But that would soon change. The next few years saw Crowley returning to England to sort out his life and finances, and then founding a new order to carry forward the torch that the Golden Dawn had dropped. In the process, he would publish prodigiously and begin to gather around him a small cadre of students and disciples. The Aeon of Horus had been proclaimed. The task was now to broadcast its law to humanity, starting with a handful of aspirants who might listen. The period immediately after the time in Cairo and the revelation was pretty tumultuous for Crowley on a personal level. The responsibilities of marriage, fatherhood, financial management, they were not roles that he handled with grace at all, really. In 1905, while Crowley was embroiled in the deadly Kanchenjunga climb in the Himalayas, his wife Rose was still in India, grieving the loss of their little baby daughter. By the time Crowley rejoined Rose, later in 1906, he found her already struggling with alcoholism and deep depression. Now, as for Crowley himself, he wasn't in great shape either. Years of high-altitude exertion, malaria, and perhaps the psychic strain of his intense occult work had taken quite a toll on his health. He underwent a series of minor surgeries back in Britain and convalesced sporadically. The marriage of Aleister and Rose deteriorated rapidly under all this stress. Crowley responded to Rose's drinking with a mixture of concern and frustration. He tried to involve her in his magical work, perhaps hoping to rekindle that spiritual inspiration she'd shown in Cairo. In 1906, he even recorded experiments where Rose functioned as a medium again. But the magic that had bound them momentarily in Egypt seemed to have fled, both figuratively and literally, I suppose. Crowley's diary from 1906 to 7 revealed a domestic life unraveling. Rose would become incoherent from wine, and Crowley increasingly unfaithful, seeking other lovers and muses. During this time, Crowley's writing output was prolific. He established a publishing venture called the Society for the Propagation of Religious Truth, cheekily parodying the Christian Tract Society's name, primarily to publish his own works. He compiled his poetry into a 3-volume collected works which he funded himself, and he kept producing new writings, essays, plays, and verse. Critical reception of his literary efforts was mixed. Some appreciated his flair, while others were appalled by the subject matter, or dismissed him as a pretentious provocateur. None of these books sold especially well, which added to the financial strain. In an attempt at publicity, Crowley even offered a prize for the best essay about his own poetry. Now the winner was J.F.C. Fuller, a young army officer and literary critic, whose laudatory essay, The Star in the West, praised Crowley's poetry to the skies. Of course, Fuller would later become a disciple, and one of the first to take Crowley's religious role seriously, though their association later ended. Well, amidst all these literary and personal upheavals, Crowley took an important practical step. He acquired a headquarters. In 1899, he had purchased Boleskine House, a manor on the shore of Loch Ness in Scotland, intending it as a secluded location for magical retirement. Now, Boleskine became his retreat and temple, and it was at Boleskine in 1907 that Crowley returned in earnest to the mystical practices he'd left unfinished. Years before, he had begun preparations for the elaborate ritual known as the sacred magic of Abramelin, intended to invoke one's holy guardian angel. But he abandoned it to go assist Mathers during the Golden Dawn schism. Now, with newfound focus, Crowley resumed his intensive meditations and invocations at Boleskine, often with his friend and fellow occultist George Cecil Jones joining him. Crowley did report that in the summer of 1907, during ritual and drug-induced trances, he experienced a series of new communications from the supernatural source Aiwass. In October and November of that year, Crowley wrote down several inspired texts, which he labeled the Holy Books of Thelema. These included Liber 7 and Liber Cordis Cinque Serpente, Cincte Serpente rather, which he claimed were dictated by higher powers, similar to the Book of the Law. Suppose there's no way to prove him wrong on that one, I suppose. Anyway, the poetic style of these books is exalted and cryptic. Crowley treated them as Class A texts, meaning not a word was to be changed, because they were of divine origin. The reception of these holy books reaffirmed to Crowley that Thelema was an objective of spiritual truth, not just a personal creed. Notably, in one of these revelations, he perceived that the mislaid manuscript of the Book of the Law had suddenly resurfaced at Boleskine, an event that he took as a sign that the time had come to propagate Thelema in a more public fashion. On the family front, by late 1907, he and Rose were essentially separated. Their second daughter, Lola Zaza, was born in early 1907 and left in Rose's care, but under the watch of her family. With regret, yet resolve, Crowley initiated divorce proceedings in November of 1909, citing his own adultery, an odd but then pretty legally expedient choice, perhaps to avoid blaming Rose's alcohol in court. Rose's drinking had worsened, to the point where her family eventually committed her to an asylum in 1911. Not the kind of place you want to be in 1911, that's for sure, if you've watched my asylum videos. Well, Crowley, despite everything, remained fond of Rose and assisted her with care financially where he could. But he had moved on, at least in his heart, to a new phase of life and work. He had realized that to fulfill his self-imposed destiny as a prophet of Thelema, he needed an organization and a public platform. In the latter part of 1907, Crowley took a decisive step to establish himself as a leader in the occult world. He did this by forming a new magical order. Along with the friend of his, George Cecil Jones, they founded the order that they called the AA, which stood for Argentium Astrum, or in Latin, the Silver Star. The AA was conceived as a successor to the Golden Dawn, but on new Thelemic principles. Rather than being a social lodge with democratic votes and power struggles, the AA was structured as a chain of initiation, where each member worked largely independently through a graded curriculum under the mentorship of the grade above. Crowley deliberately kept the organization relatively austere and focused on personal spiritual attainment. Its headquarters was initially in a small London flat at 124 Victoria Street, which Crowley and Jones made into a temple space, and here they performed initiations and taught select students who were attracted to Crowley's reputation or writings, and there was no shortage of them, that's for sure. The early members of the AA included some notable talents too. J.F.C. Fuller, fresh off his panegyric essay about Crowley, was involved at the start, though he didn't stick around for too long. An eccentric young artist, Austin Osman Spare, known for his remarkable draftsman skill, and later famous in his own right for his own system of sigil magic, was briefly associated with Crowley at this time, illustrating some of his works. Even the distinguished physicist and psychical researcher, Oliver Lodge, showed glancing interests in Crowley's thoughts, though not formally joining up into the order. But most dedicated of Crowley's new disciples was Victor Newberg, who was actually a Cambridge graduate whom Crowley had met in 1907. Newberg became Crowley's intimate companion, a student, and in a sense a magical prodigy. Together they undertook some of the most intense rituals of the AA's early days. By 1908, Crowley and Newberg were pushing boundaries in both mystical and physical arenas. One notable experiment was Crowley's so-called Paris working, though the major one by that time was in 1914. Earlier they did a preliminary working in Spain and Morocco. In summer of 1908, Crowley retreated to a villa in Coruña, Spain, and kept a frank diary of concentrated magical invocations of the deity Thoth. The Greek rendering equivalent would be Mercury, the Latin Roman, rather. Well, this diary, titled John St. John, was later published in the first issue of the Equinox, and provided a rare, candid window into Crowley's daily discipline of yoga, ritual, and even drug use in pursuit of enlightenment. The diary demonstrated Crowley's willingness to publicly document the nitty-gritty details of occult practice, demystifying it for aspirants. Crowley's creativity in 1907 to 1909 was astonishing. Besides the holy books received in trances, he wrote practical instructional texts for the AA, such as Liber E, exercises for concentration and yoga, and Liber O, basic ritual techniques. He compiled a comprehensive treatise on magical and mystical correspondences, 777, which became a reference work for students of Kabbalah and Magick. He also penned some of his most beautiful poetry volumes, like Ambergris, and one of his most curious works, Contes en Pax, an eclectic collection mixing allegory, humor, and serious mysticism. In a bold effort to share the AA teachings with the world, Crowley launched a biannual periodical named The Equinox in March 1909, subtitled The Review of Scientific Illuminism. The Equinox was a hefty journal that contained a mix of ritual instruction, spiritual essays, original poetry and fiction, and records of magical experiments. Crowley served as editor and main contributor, writing under various pseudonyms as well as his own name, and he threw in work by his students and colleagues too. For instance, the poet Ethel Archer and disciple Victor Newberg had pieces in it, and Crowley even published fiction by outside writers that he thought was interesting. It was a bit of a free-for-all. I suppose the Equinox was, in Crowley's mind, even a trumpet blast announcing a new force in occultism had arrived, and it was him. Well, it was also extremely costly to produce. Printing ain't cheap. It was lavishly bound and typeset, and Crowley underwrote it until his inheritance funds began to run dry. Within the pages of the Equinox and beyond, Crowley made clear that Thelema was the core of his system. One of the first issues published, the text of the Book of the Law itself, albeit in coded form. See, Crowley had had a few hesitations about printing it openly at first, so he released it with a cipher key. Crowley was, by 1909, coming around to fully embracing his role as the prophet of Thelema. That year, he had a pivotal experience that cemented his commitment. During a walk in the desert of North Africa, he suddenly understood that Thelema was not just his personal creed, but an objective truth for the new era. This realization came when traveling in Algeria with Newberg. In late 1909, Crowley and Newberg undertook what many consider to be Crowley's greatest magical operation, the exploration of the Enochian aethers. Enochian magic, originally scribed by John Dee and Edward Kelly in the 16th century, involves a series of 30 aethers or planes of consciousness. Crowley decided to traverse these planes. Well, he did this psychically, from the highest to lowest. Two men ventured near the Algerian desert far from distraction, and over several weeks invoked each aether in turn, with Newberg acting as scribe, while Crowley entered the visionary trances. The visions Crowley experienced were profound, often terrifying and transformative. They were recorded and later published in the Equinox as The Vision and the Voice. One notable episode occurred in the 10th Aether, where Crowley confronted the demon Choronzon, the very personification of chaotic dispersion. In a dramatic trial, Crowley, within a protective magic circle, had Newberg sit at the edge and channel the voice of whatever entity appeared in a triangle outside the circle. The ensuing encounter with the Choronzon, which manifested through Newberg's increasingly frenzied speech, ended with Newberg having to physically wrestle a sand-spewing, delusion-casting presence that tried to break the circle. Crowley considered this a triumph, in which he and Newberg contained and dispersed the demon. An allegory, perhaps, for conquering the ego's last barriers before enlightenment. Suppose we can look at it like that? Well, these workings deeply affected both men. Crowley emerged claiming as a significant spiritual attainment, and Newberg's loyalty was sealed. At least for a time. He would part ways later on under emotional strain. But it is worth noting that in the midst of such activities, Crowley's personal life and finances were under great pressure. He was no longer flush with endless inheritance money. All that old brewery cash had gone away. Maintaining Boleskine, publishing his books and journals, traveling, and indulging in the costly ceremonies all burned through cash. A practical response was that Crowley began to accept more paying students into the AA. The fees helped, though his generosity to broke disciples often meant that he subsidized them. But another response was something a bit more controversial. Crowley started to realize the potential of sex, particularly his own unconventional sex life, as a source of magical power and perhaps even patronage. By 1910, Crowley had taken on new lovers who also became magical partners. One was Layla Waddle, an accomplished Australian violinist whom he dubbed Soror Violin and later Layla. She became his mistress and muse, inspiring love poetry and participating in his rituals. Another partner was Mary Desty, an American art patron whom Crowley met in Paris. She served for a time as his Scarlet Woman, a title he gave to his principal female magical collaborator, derived from the Book of Revelations archetype. And so by the end of 1909, Crowley's divorce from Rose was all said and done. He had formally severed ties with his old life. Rose's institutionalization the following year was a sad epilogue to that chapter. Remember, she got thrown into an asylum. Crowley took custody of some of their personal papers and moved on. Maybe he was a little bit guilt-ridden, but convinced he was following his true will. In an almost symbolic act, 1909 was also the year that he resigned from the Freemasons, to the extent that he had a real connection to Masonry, and any other affiliations that might claim his allegiance. From now on, AA and Thelema were his focus. To sum it up, by 1910, Crowley had reinvented himself. He was no longer a poet dabbling in occultism, but he was the head of a magical order, the editor of a respected occult journal, the author of secret holy books and public instruction manuals, and the self-proclaimed prophet of a new age. This was a fertile and energetic period for him, but it was also just the beginning of his public notoriety. The next phase would see Crowley stepping onto a larger stage, courting both fame and infamy as he extended his work from the private order to public performance and engaged in the broader occult circles through the Ordo Templi Orientis. Flush with the momentum of his new order and revelations, Crowley began to stage more public-facing occult activities in the years 1909 to 1911. This was a period of both creative flourishing and the beginnings of a serious scandal in his life. Crowley had never been one to hide in the shadows completely, that's for sure. He certainly enjoyed provoking society, prodding at the sensibilities, and now he consciously sought to make a splash to attract broader interest and perhaps recruits to his cause of scientific illuminism. One novel idea Crowley implemented was the performance of magical rituals in public art. In 1910, he organized a series of ritualistic plays known as the Rites of Eleusis. Of course, the name rings a bell, I'm sure. These were modeled loosely on the ancient Greek Eleusinian mysteries, but in reality they were more original ceremonies written by Crowley himself, each dedicated to a classical deity. Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, etc. That kind of thing. Well, they incorporated poetry, music, dramatic costumes and lighting, early multimedia performances in a sense, and Crowley himself, along with several of his students, including Layla Waddell on violin and Victor Newberg dancing or intoning roles, performed these rites on stage at London at Caxton Hall. The attendees who bought tickets were treated to an atmosphere thick with incense and exotic symbolism. Unbeknownst to most of the audience, Crowley also laced a non-alcoholic wine punch with an exotic entheogen, peyote extract. He wanted the spectators to have at least a mild mystical experience, or at least an altered perception to appreciate the symbolism, and some journalists attended later wrote about the rites. Press coverage was mixed. Some reporters found the performances intriguing and artistic, while others mocked them or hinted darkly that something blasphemous was afoot. One newspaper derisively called Crowley, quote, one of the most blasphemous and cold-blooded villains of modern times, linking the rites to diabolism purely on hearsay. I'm sure that Crowley was delighted to hear that review. Nonetheless, the events gained Crowley a bit of positive notoriety among the avant-garde. There was something new and daring in the Edwardian London cultural scene. However, increased publicity brought increased scrutiny. The more conservative press started to take jabs at Crowley's personal life. One editor, West Dewend Fenton, of The Looking Glass, went so far as to insinuate in print that Crowley and his close male associate George Cecil Jones were engaged in immoral acts. In other words, accusing them of homosexuality, which was still a crime and a scandalous allegation at the time. But Crowley's reaction to such accusations was somewhat paradoxical. Personally, he couldn't care less if the world knew he was bisexual. He was quite frank about his same-sex experiences in his unpublished writings, and he saw the whole thing as a sacrament beyond conventional categories. In any case, his students and associates like Jones, who had respectable family lives and careers, were mortified. Jones even sued The Looking Glass for libel, although he lost, given the difficulty of proving the falsehood of innuendo in that era. The fallout from these controversies strained Crowley's relationships. Now that J.F.C. Fuller, he had been so enthusiastic, but now he broke off his friendship around this time, possibly disillusioned by Crowley's relentless craving for attention, or perhaps by the rumors. But Crowley remained unbowed. Indeed, he doubled down on sensationalism on his own way. When Mathers, his Golden Dawn chief of the old times, sued Crowley in 1910 for publishing Golden Dawn secrets in the Equinox, Crowley fought back in court, and he won. The judge concluded that the so-called secrets like Enochian calls and rituals, were essentially in the public domain, or effectively of no commercial value. Now, in terms of the trial, that made headlines, and Crowley delighted in playing the media's great beast caricature, hinting at dark powers and rituals with a twinkle in his eye of sorts. The notoriety drew curiosity seekers to him, some of whom began genuine converts to his teachings. Amid all these flamboyant exploits, Crowley's deeper esoteric work continued. In 1911 he spent time in the bohemian milieu of Paris, where he made a connection with the American expatriate named Mary Desty, who we've mentioned. Now remember, Desty became Crowley's next Scarlet Woman after Layla Waddell. With Desty, Crowley engaged in a series of magical sessions in Switzerland, where she acted as a medium. Crowley believed a high spiritual being, one of the, quote, secret chiefs he had long hypothesized was communicating through Desty's entranced speech. The entity called himself Abul-Diz, and delivered metaphysical pronouncements. From these sessions emerged a major work of Crowley's Book 4. This was a comprehensive exposition of his magical system, incorporating yoga, theory of magic, and all sorts of ritual practice. Importantly, around this time, Crowley introduced a spelling change that has endured. He began spelling Magick with a C-K. Now that is to distinguish the spiritual discipline from the works of Houdini, those stage conjurers. Book 4 was serialized in the Equinox and later published in parts, some parts co-written or at least inspired by Desty's trance utterances. But for serious students, it became something of a Bible of Crowley's methodology, laying out the meditation practices, symbolization of the wand, cup, dagger, etc., and the underlying philosophy that the magician's goal is the knowledge and conversion of the holy guardian angel, the term for achieving one's true will and divine guidance. In any case, by 1912, Crowley had successfully carved out a niche as an occult teacher with international repute. The AA had lodges, or at least active students, in Britain and abroad. There were a couple of North American members, too, at this time. However, something new was on the horizon, something that would expand Crowley's influence further. A European esoteric fraternity named Ordo Templi Orientis was about to intersect with his destiny. But before we transition to that, there's one final detail worth noting, a little anecdote. In 1911, Crowley, ever the mountaineer at heart, climbed not a mountain, but the social heights briefly by befriending some in the literati and art world. One friend, the novelist Somerset Maugham, had met Crowley back in Paris in 1902, and later used Crowley as the model for the villain in his novel The Magician, 1908. Of course, you might expect that Crowley relished in being cast as a diabolical character in fiction. Another odd intersection. The emerging field of psychoanalysis touched him when he met the psychologist Alfred Adler in 1912, who apparently analyzed one of Crowley's dreams. Crowley's openness to such new ideas, he was apparently fascinated by psychoanalysis and would later correspond with Freud's circle too, shows that while he portrayed himself as a master therion, the magical persona, he was also quite aware of and engaged in contemporary intellectual currents. He was always a modern man, as well as an occultist. By 1912, Crowley had cultivated a small but fervent following. He had weathered public ridicule and some scandal, and he had established himself as an authority in practical occult training. It all set the stage for him to assume leadership in a broader occult fraternity, one that would link him to a continental network and introduce a crucial element of his mature magic, the formalized practice of sexual magic. That came with his involvement in Ordo Templi Orientis, which we will talk about now. It was 1912, and in this year Crowley's occult career took a significant turn when he became involved in the Ordo Templi Orientis, a secretive fraternal order with its origins in Germany. The O.T.O. claimed to impart the inner secrets of Freemasonry, alchemy, and other esoteric disciplines, and was structured in a system of degrees, somewhat like Masonry. Its leaders had been reading the equinox and paying attention to Crowley's rise. What precipitated their contact was Crowley's publication of the Book of Lies, a collection of paradoxical and mystical aphorisms that he released in 1913, though dated 1912. Under his magical name, Frater Perdurabo. The Book of Lies is a pretty peculiar work, actually. Each chapter or page or so of cryptic verse or prose, often with a humorous or blasphemous bent to it. And it also was a showcase of Crowley's wit as well as wisdom, and he mixed it in with a bit of Kabbalistic ciphers and in-jokes. But unbeknownst to him, one of those chapters apparently revealed, in veiled form, one of the O.T.O's deepest secrets, the use of sexual energy in ritual, specifically a technique of sex magic. According to the oft-repeated story, Theodore Roos, head of the O.T.O, confronted Crowley in London, accusing him of having published the O.T.O's Secret of the Ninth Degree in the Book of Lies. Crowley was confused at first. He had not knowingly taken anything from the O.T.O, since he wasn't a member at the time. But as Rose pointed out the offending passage, Crowley realized that by intuition or luck, he had indeed touched on the same powerful idea, that the sex act, and orgasm in particular, could be used as a magical act of creation and a sacrament. Crowley effectively said that he didn't know that was their secret, but since they think that he did know, perhaps he should understand it properly. The confrontation eventually melted into friendship, and Ruth saw an opportunity, better to co-opt this talented firebrand than to oppose him. He promptly chartered Crowley to the head of the British section of the O.T.O, which Crowley reorganized as he saw fit. Crowley took the magical name Baphomet in the O.T.O and was proclaimed X, the 10th degree, National Grand Master for Great Britain and Ireland, and by Crowley's cheek, Iona and all the Britons. He named the British O.T.O brands Mysteria, Mystica, Maxima, or MMM. This alliance was significant for several reasons. First, it gave Crowley an existing lodge framework and an air of European legitimacy. Second, it brought Crowley fully into the realm of explicit sex magic. The AA had always been about personal enlightenment and core mystical attainments. O.T.O, especially under Crowley's influence, would focus on harnessing sexual force for spiritual and magical ends. Crowley embraced this with gusto. He rewrote large portions of the O.T.O initiation rituals, infusing them with the Thelemic symbolism and verses. He also integrated Thelema as the philosophical core of the O.T.O teachings, essentially turning the O.T.O into an outer vehicle to spread Thelema to a broader membership that might not all be mystics, but were drawn by the allure of an occult fraternity, promising esoteric secrets. And, well, I'm sure that the sexual side of it certainly attracted quite a larger crowd. Well, talking about that, the adoption of sex magic into Crowley's practice was not a huge leap for him personally. You see, he'd already in private been exploring the connection between sexual ecstasy and magical will, but now he codified it. He delineated different degrees of sex magic.
Hints suggested that the 9th degree involved the use of secretions of orgasm in magical sacrament, while the 11th degree, which Crowley uniquely added emphasized, involved other kinds of intercourse as a magical act, particularly sodomy and all the rest. Now, Crowley and select initiates experimented with these techniques, treating the orgasm or sexual fluid as a talismanic substance to charge with intent or as an offering to spiritual entities. It was certainly highly unorthodox and taboo-shattering in a society where even discussing contraception was risque. Crowley kept these inner teachings private within the order, but rumors inevitably seeped out, further tarnishing his public image when hostile parties got wind. During 1913, Crowley continued to travel and promote his work. He took Layla Waddell, that violinist lover, and a troupe called the Ragged Ragtime Girls to perform in Moscow, with Crowley as their manager. The tour was a strange intersection of show business and magic, ostensible entertainment, but Crowley also indulged in magical affairs in Moscow. Some have speculated he might have been doing intelligence work on the side. Later associates like biographer Tobias Churton have suggested Crowley occasionally freelanced for British intelligence, and a trip to Moscow on the eve of World War I is something cited as suspicious, but concrete evidence for that is lacking. Still, probably best to mention it. Well, what we do know is that in Moscow he wrote his famous hymn to Pan, an ecstatic poem to the god of lust and nature, which became a staple of O.T.O rituals. He also composed the Gnostic Mass, that is Liber 15, in 1913, which is a Thelemic Eucharistic ceremony. The Gnostic Mass involves a priest and priestess engaging in symbolic, and at least in Crowley's ideal, literal consecration of wine and cake that contains sexual essences, celebrating love under will. This Mass is among Crowley's most beautiful liturgical creations, and it remains the central rite in the O.T.O to this day. By 1914, Crowley's relationship with Victor Newberg had deteriorated. After their intense magical and sexual work together, a confrontation occurred. The exact details are a little bit murky, but it does seem that Crowley, always a mercurial master, subjected Newberg to a brutal magical curse after an argument, effectively expelling him. Heartbroken and shattered, Newberg left Crowley's circle and never fully returned to occult life, finding some solace in conventional Judaism later. This was a pattern with Crowley. He could inspire students to remarkable spiritual heights, but his demanding, imperious manner often led to breaks and personal wreckage in his wake. But you can't discuss this period without noting Crowley's financial state. It was dire, to say the least. By 1914, he had spent or given away most of his inheritance. The lavish publication of the Equinox, his constant travel, supporting various dependents, collecting rare books and art, all of it had drained his resources. To make matters worse, in early 1914 he decided to cease publishing the Equinox after 10 issues. He had hoped the journal would attract enough subscriptions to sustain itself, but it never did. His last issue in 1913 had a notorious editorial when he printed a sensationalized interview supposedly revealing scandalous things about various individuals, thinly veiled references to his enemies and to some extent himself, which created quite an uproar. The Equinox, while treasured now by occult historians, had not been a commercial success by any stretch of the word. Crowley was near bankrupt and needed a change of scenery. Conveniently, another dramatic shift in world events would provide him with that opportunity: the outbreak of World War I in mid-1914. Thus, By mid-1914, Crowley's life in London was becoming untenable, not just monetarily, but in terms of reputation. The tabloids were labeling him traitorous scum for minor reasons, and soon major reasons, as we'll get to. So he opted to sail to the United States, beginning a new chapter abroad. But before leaving Europe, he made one more bizarre attempt at artistic, magical mischief. In early 1914 in Paris, Crowley and a fellow bohemian staged what is known as the Paris Working, an extended ritual retreat focusing on the gods Mercury and Jupiter, fueled by hashish and ether and continual sexual rites, which led Crowley to pen the Liber Agape, an instructional treatise on sex magic. This working also precipitated the final split with Newburgh during a sadomasochistic ritual, where Crowley pushed him beyond his limits. In summary, Crowley's O.T.O phase up to 1914 solidified his legacy in two key ways. It wove sexual magic into the fabric of modern occult practice, and it spread Thelema through an organizational body beyond the AA. Also, however, it added layers to his infamy. Whispers of orgies, black masses, the vile acts began to cling to Crowley's name, some wildly exaggerated by enemies, but some rooted in real events, albeit interpreted without much understanding by outsiders. Crowley didn't shrink from this notoriety. If anything, he sometimes cultivated it, believing that to shock the bourgeois was a noble endeavor, and that eventually the truth of his spiritual genius would be recognized. People just had to wait. He probably thought he was a little bit before his time. In any case, as Europe marched to war in 1914, Crowley took his leave. His journey to America during World War I would yield its own peculiar adventures, ranging from alleged espionage to visionary artwork on New York's Hudson River cliffs, and see Crowley attempt to propagate Thelema in the New World amid personal struggles with love and addiction. And so the great beast crosses the Atlantic, and the story would only continue to get stranger. When World War I erupted in the summer of 1914, Crowley found himself at a crossroads, practically penniless and painted by some in the British press as a scandalous figure. He left England. In October 1914, Crowley boarded the RMS Lusitania and arrived in New York City with little fanfare. America would be his home for the next several years, and during this period, his life took on an even more eccentric and enigmatic character. He went into journalism and politics in ways that later fueled allegations of treason. He pursued new romances and magical workings, and he struggled with increasing drug dependence, all while trying to keep the flame of Thelema alive and well in a foreign land. He wasted no time immersing himself in New York's cultural scene. He lived in various hotels and apartments in Manhattan, rubbing shoulders with artists, writers, and fellow expatriates. And to earn some money, he wrote freelance articles, oddly enough often on astrology or book reviews for magazines. He even penned pieces for Vanity Fair, the American edition, on such topics such as the art of pranayama yoga and the merits of various poetic styles. Using his gift for self-promotion, he also networked with editors and literati, and his urbane charm won him a few good friends. But a controversial aspect of Crowley's U.S. stay is his involvement in political propaganda. Crowley had publicly expressed sympathy for Irish independence from Britain, and opportunistically for Germany's cause in the war. Of course, these were positions that shocked his British acquaintances. I don't know which one they would be more offended at. Now, in New York, Crowley befriended the German-American propagandist George Sylvester Viereck, and soon became a contributor to Viereck's journal, The Fatherland. Now, the Fatherland was a pro-German weekly aimed at keeping the US neutral, or at least swaying American opinion in favor of Germany. Crowley wrote bombastic articles and even poems for this paper lambasting British war policies and extolling Irish freedom. For example, he penned an open letter calling Kaiser Wilhelm a mystic and visionary, and advocated that the Irish revolutionary Roger Casement, then in German custody, be freed to foment rebellion against the British. To any casual observer, Crowley's actions looked undeniably pro-German and decidedly anti-British. Of course, this stance had consequences. The British weren't just going to take that lying down back at the Home Office. British newspapers got wind of Crowley's opinions and denounced him as a vile traitor. Years later, Crowley would insist that he'd just been playing a double game, insinuating his work for the Fatherland was actually a ruse sanctioned by British intelligence to undermine the German propaganda effort by making it absurd and overly bombastic. And it is true that Crowley's contributions were often hyperbolic to the point of self-parody. One theory is he was trying to discredit the magazine by being so over the top. However, there is scant evidence that British authorities actually enlisted him. Most likely, Crowley volunteered himself in his own mind as a secret agent. Regardless of intent, this episode cemented Crowley's toxic reputation in Britain. It would haunt him as proof of villainy. Meanwhile, Crowley's occult and personal life carried on in a lively fashion. In New York, he met a journalist and poet named Jean Robert Foster, with whom he had an affair and traveled across the country. Crowley visited the West Coast in 1915, making stops in Vancouver to meet Charles Stansfield Jones, his leading disciple in Canada, and then San Francisco, Los Angeles, and even trekking to remote spots like the Grand Canyon. Along the way, he experimented with peyote extensively and introduced some bohemian friends to it. In one famous incident in Detroit, he tested peyote at the Park Davis Laboratory as part of an experimental inquiry, illustrative of how Crowley straddled the worlds of science and magic. Another romantic entanglement emerged with a woman named Roddy Minor in New York. Roddy became Crowley's mistress in 1917, and he dubbed her the New Scarlet Woman. With Roddy, Crowley embarked on what he called the Amalantra working in 1918, a series of visionary seances and magic rituals aimed to contact otherworldly entities. Through Roddy, in trance, Crowley believed they made psychic contact with an intelligence named Lamb, often depicted as vaguely alien, a large-headed figure in a drawing Crowley made. Decades later, UFO enthusiasts would curiously note Lamb's similarity to the Grey aliens, but Crowley considered Lamb a spirit from the astral plane, not an extraterrestrial in the sci-fi sense of things. The Amalantra working generated a rich journal of visions and symbols, feeding into Crowley's evolving cosmology, where various preter-human intelligences were guiding him towards some grand spiritual goal. However, this relationship with Roddy did not last beyond the working. She left. Perhaps she was exhausted by Crowley's intensity. We don't know. In any case, Crowley's constant throughout his US years was writing, and more writing. In 1917, he conceived an ambitious project to restart the Equinox, packaging a new volume as the Equinox Volume 3, Number 1, subtitled The Blue Equinox because of its blue cover. Published in 1919, just as he was leaving America, this hefty book served as a status report for the O.T.O and the AA, including manifestos and curriculum for his orders, and a few essays on mysticism. It tried to cast Thelema as a serious spiritual movement, listing its lodges and printing key documents like the Liber Legis, the Book of the Law, and Liber Oz, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, for perhaps the first time openly in a public volume. The Blue Equinox also acknowledged the help of certain Americans who had become old patrons or allies, suggesting that Crowley wasn't entirely without support. But notably, he did attract a handful of U.S. devotees, including soldiers and socialites interested in the occult. One of them, Wilfred Talbot Smith, would go on to found an O.T.O lodge in California in the 1930s, under Crowley's distant guidance. But it was also during these wartime years that Crowley's health and habits began to take a turn. He'd long struggled with asthma, and physicians had prescribed him heroin. I know, right? Sounds weird, but at that time it was actually a legal medication. This was to alleviate bronchial spasms. Of course, as we all know now, heroin is a little bit addictive. And by around 1919, Crowley was firmly within its grip. He was using morphine or heroin daily. This did not immediately curtail his activities. If anything, he wrote prodigiously under narcotic influence, including his first novel, Diary of a Drug Fiend, written in 1920, drawing no doubt partly on his own personal experience. But the pattern of dependency and withdrawal would become a dire issue in his later life. By late 1918, with the Great War ending, Crowley's American adventure was winding down somewhat. His welcome in New York had worn thin, one factor being that Vierik's Fatherland magazine was shut down once the U.S. entered the war, ending any pseudo-spy games that Crowley had. Another being that he had fallen out with some supporters or exhausted them. He undertook one more memorable magical retreat in the summer of 1918. He spent 40 days on Esopus Island, a little wooded island on the Hudson River, living in a tent. There, in imitation of religious seclusion, he fasted, at least to a point. He meditated, he painted strange murals on the rocks and communed with nature. He later said he experienced visions of past lives during this retreat. Locals who encountered him performing rituals on the cliffs likely found the Englishman quite bizarre. But it was a time of spiritual replenishment for Crowley. After all that urban chaos, getting out of the city will do wonders for you, don't you agree? So in December of 1919, Crowley boarded a ship back to Europe. He'd been absent from the UK for 5 years, and returned not as a triumphant prophet, but a penniless, scandal-ridden mystic, now with a heroin addiction to boot. Nonetheless, he returned with renewed determination to fulfill his great work. In the United States, he had planted seeds. Thelema had a foothold with a few earnest practitioners, and he had refined his teachings through writing. Perhaps most significantly for his next phase, in America, Crowley had connected by correspondence one of his most devoted future disciples, Jane Wolfe, a Hollywood silent film actress fascinated by occultism. But she would soon abandon that career to join Crowley in Europe. So by early 1920, Crowley was back in London, lodging with friends, persona non grata in respectable society, yet filled with grand plans and visions. Out of the crucible of the war years emerged his next bold experiment, the founding of an intentional magical community, where Thelema could be lived day in, day out. This would be the infamous Abbey of Thelema in Cefalo, Sicily, an episode that would amplify Crowley's notoriety to global proportions. But as we will see, that notoriety came at a great personal cost, and signaled the beginning of the end for Crowley's ability to operate unchecked. In 1920, Crowley embarked on what he envisioned as the crowning project of his spiritual mission, as the establishment of a kind of utopian community devoted to living under the law of Thelema, inspired by the fictional Abbey of Thelema in Francois Rabelais' Renaissance satire, where the motto was, "Do what thou wilt," actually. Crowley sought to create a real-world Abbey of Thelema. He imagined a small, disciplined colony of Thelemites who would practice magic daily, free themselves from societal conditioning, and serve as a model for the new aeon's way of life. Well, where to find the right setting for that? Crowley and his closest disciples turned to an unlikely location, that secluded old villa near the coastal town of Cefalù in Sicily, Italy. Crowley consulted the I Ching, that is a Chinese divination text that he often used for guidance about the move, and it seemed to be quite favorable. He didn't need any more convincing. In April of 1920, he, along with his lover at that time, Leah Hirsig, and a few followers arrived in Cefalù and rented a small single-story farmhouse structure which they dubbed the Abbey. Leah Hirsig, whom Crowley had met in New York, and who traveled across the Atlantic to be with him, was an intelligent Swiss-American woman who took the magical name Aleister. Crowley recognized her as his new Scarlet Woman, a female counterpart who would help channel his inspiration. She was devoted and unafraid of the rigors of what lay ahead. They were soon joined by others. Leah's newborn baby by Crowley, a daughter named Anne Lee. Well, though tragically this infant would die a few months later from illness, an all too common sorrow in that era of limited medical care. Another woman, Ninette Shumway, an American Thelemite, came with her own young son. Ninette would become another of Crowley's mistresses at the Abbey, and soon bore him a child as well, a daughter named Astarte Lulupanthea, though this baby too died in infancy. This reflects the precarious conditions on Cefalù. Over time, about a dozen individuals passed through the Abbey. They included Crowley's old student and friend, Raoul Loveday, and Loveday's wife, Betty May, whose presence would prove to be fateful. We'll get to that in a minute. As well as Jane Wolfe, the Hollywood actress who arrived enthusiastic to serve Crowley, and Cecil Frederick Russell, an idealistic young man from the U.S. Life at the Abbey was deliberately unconventional. Crowley wanted to break the ingrained habits and inhibitions of his companions. The days began at sunrise with the adorations to the sun, a practice from Crowley's Liber Resh, aligning devotees with solar energies 4 times a day. Communal activities included yoga, ritual, and creative or scholarly work. Crowley painted murals on the walls. Vivid, erotic frescoes and occult images adorned the Abbey's interior, turning it into a temple of sorts. Cleanliness and comfort were not high priorities. In fact, Crowley allowed the place to become quite squalid by normal standards, reasoning that one should transcend trivial concerns like housekeeping. Okay, then. There was no set cleaning schedule, and goats and dogs roamed freely in and out, adding to the mess. The children ran about naked and were allowed to witness the magical ceremonies, though not directly participate in them, on the theory that they should grow up without Christian shame around the body or natural functions. Magical rituals, including the Gnostic Mass and invocations, took place frequently. Crowley continued to experiment with sex magic with Leah and the other Scarlet Women in private workings, seeking even deeper illuminations. He also wrote copiously, commentaries on the Book of the Law, polemical essays, and Confessions, an autobiography he had begun drafting. Interestingly, despite the libertine atmosphere, there was also an emphasis on scholarly discipline. Crowley gave lessons in subjects ranging from astrology to French to his individual disciples, He wanted the Abbey to produce enlightened and capable people. One hallmark of the Thelemic practice at Cephalou was confronting the ego. For instance, Crowley implemented an exercise where residents had to cut themselves with a razor or knife every time they used the pronoun I to break down ego identification. They indulged in what one might call shamanic practices too, ingestion of psychoactives like peyote and rituals, and perhaps testing endurance through fasting or chaste periods followed by orgiastic release. Crowley, however, was increasingly under the dominion of heroin. He tried at least once to quit cold turkey while at the Abbey, going to Paris in 1922 for a painful withdrawal, but he relapsed soon after. This put a dark shadow over the utopia. Crowley's highs and lows on the drug made his behavior unpredictable, and funds that could have improved living conditions went to supporting his habit. Despite hardship, in Crowley's own recollection, the early days of the Abbey were idyllic. It was his idea of heaven, describing a routine of meditation, creative work, and simple pleasures under the Sicilian sun. I tell you, Sicily's not a bad place to be. In any case, indeed some followers like Jane Wolfe found the experience to be quite transformative, writing in her diary that she had never felt such spiritual growth. But not everyone thrived. One resident, C.F. Russell, left after quarreling with Crowley. He balked at the bisexual and homoerotic aspects of some magic he was asked to perform, and grew disillusioned, later accusing Crowley of abusive tactics. Others struggled with the Spartan lifestyle and intense psychological challenges. But the episode that truly unraveled the Abbey's existence was the death of Raoul Loveday in February 1923. Loveday, a 23-year-old Oxford graduate, deeply committed to Crowley, took ill after a few months. Accounts differ. Some say he drank from a polluted mountain spring, contracting an infection, likely liver inflammation or acute enteric fever. Crowley's detractors spread a more sensational story, that Loveday fell sick after participating in a ritual that he drank the blood of a cat that Crowley had sacrificed. This cat blood tale seems to originate from Loveday's widow, Betty May, who had never warmed to Crowley or the Abbey's rigors. In fact, Betty hated life on Sicily. She found the rules strange, the environment disgusting, and suspected Crowley was a dangerous deviant. When her husband died, Betty fled back to London, heartbroken and furious. He went straight to the press to give an interview, painting Crowley as a monster. She claimed, in essence, that Crowley's black magic and depravity had killed her husband. Her stories included lurid details, the cat blood rite, the compulsive self-cutting whenever the pronoun I was spoken, drug-fueled orgies, and even the hints of child abuse, or at least endangerment, due to the witnessing of the more physical acts. The British press, well, they were very eager to hear all this. Crowley was already notorious, and he now became a full-fledged legend of infamy. The headlines dubbed him the wickedest man in the world, and a man we'd love to hang. They accused him of everything from Satanism to seducing underage girls to blood sacrifice and vampirism. Crowley could not afford to sue for libel, and in truth, some of the outlandish claims were hard to legally refute when he did believe in sex rituals and had indeed killed a stray cat as part of a demonstration once, but not in the way portrayed. Still, it doesn't look good. The avalanche of negative publicity effectively sealed the Abbey's fate. Italian authorities under Mussolini's growing fascist regime took notice as well, having Britain's tabloids decry that a British degenerate was performing sacrilegious acts on Italian soil was not welcome. And so in April of 1923, Crowley was served an expulsion order. The official reason was the vague, disturbing public order or some immigration technicality reason that he got kicked out for. But clearly the Mussolini government did not want the headache or any affront to Catholic morality on the island. Crowley had no choice but to pack up and leave. With his departure, the dream of the Abbey of Thelema came to abrupt end just after 3 years. The Abbey period, while ending in scandal, was extremely fruitful in Crowley's internal work. He completed important manuscripts there, including parts of his Magick in Theory and Practice, and portions of his spiritual autobiography, The Confessions, which we did mention. But externally it was a public relations disaster. Crowley left behind the literal grave of Loveday on Sicilian soil and the metaphorical grave of his reputation in the UK. The press caricature of him as a murderous black magician would stick forever. Crowley later tried to defend himself in print, but his voice was drowned out. At 48 years old, expelled from his haven, addicted to heroin, nearly penniless, and lambasted as a public villain, Crowley faced the lowest ebb of his life. The question was, what was he going to do? Would he fade into obscurity? Or did he have a few chapters left within him? Well, characteristically, Crowley was not ready to give up. The coming years would see him wandering through Europe, scrounging for supporters and sustenance, and striving to secure his literary legacy while battling personal demons. It was a period of decline in some respects, but also one where he produced some of his most reflective work, and where seeds were sown for his eventual posthumous influence. After being banished from Italy, Crowley entered a restless period of wandering across Europe and North Africa. In mid-1923, he landed in Tunis, Tunisia, accompanied by Leah Hirsig. He was physically worn down. Years of drug use and stress had made him chronically ill, and emotionally battered by the collapse of the Abbey. Nevertheless, in Tunis he tried to recuperate and focus. He attempted again to quit heroin, enduring painful withdrawal symptoms that he journaled about with brutal honesty. Leah Hirsig stood by him for a time, but their relationship, once so idealistic, was beginning to crack under the strain of poverty and Crowley's irritable and sometimes cruel demeanor. It was in Tunisia that Crowley began writing what he jokingly termed his autohagiography, that is, self-saintly biography, a work later published in part as The Confessions of Aleister Crowley. This was intended to be a grand, candid account of his life and philosophy, setting the record straight and, not incidentally, demonstrating his greatness to posterity. Crowley alternated between self-aggrandizement and surprising self-depreciation in its pages, producing a vivid narrative that mixed adventure with a bit of spiritual insight. By writing the story himself, he hoped to wrest control of the narrative from the tabloids. While Crowley's sojourn in Tunis also saw an interesting experiment in relationship dynamics. He engaged in rituals of sex magic with a local Arab boy servant, Mohammed ben Brahim, whom he took as a lover for a while. Crowley chronicled these workings as part of his exploration on different flavors, as he called them, of magical energy tied to various types of sexual expression. In his theology, every experience could be a sacrament if done under will. Still, one senses that at times in Tunis he was pushing boundaries more out of desperation for a breakthrough rather than the joy of it. By 1924, Crowley needed a change, so he moved to France. He spent his time in Nice and Paris, trying to re-establish a footing among bohemian and occult circles there. And in Paris, he underwent surgeries on his nose. Long-term cocaine use had damaged his nasal passages significantly, and he had operations to try to repair them, a further sign of the toll that his body had gone through. During his Paris stay, he encountered notable figures. He met Frank Harris, the famed Irish-American editor and writer, who admired Crowley's courage of sorts, and he visited Gurdjieff's Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man at Fontainebleau. Crowley had respect for Gurdjieff's efforts as a spiritual teacher, though he ultimately found the system not to his taste. Still, it does show that Crowley was aware of and engaged in other spiritual movements. But at this time, he was broke, so he set out to look for wealthy supporters, effectively to serve as magical pupils. One man he had enticed was Alexander Zolar, a young American astrologer who paid Crowley for training. Zolar later parted ways, perhaps disillusioned. Another was Dorothy Olson, an American woman who became Crowley's lover and student. Crowley took Dorothy to Tunisia for a private magical retreat in the desert of Neftah in 1925, where he had a mystical experience he later fictionalized in a short work, The Heart of the Master. During this retreat, Dorothy became pregnant, but sadly she miscarried, a blow that ended their romantic ties. In the aftermath, Leah Hirzig, who had been drifting away, formally renounced her role as Scarlet Woman and left Crowley's circle around 1925. Crowley, in this fashion, ritually cursed Leah as she departed, writing bitterly of feeling betrayed. Of course, Leah survived the curse, but she lived quietly thereafter in Switzerland and the US, leaving behind the wild life of an occultist. Well, amid all this, Crowley was dealing with a split in the O.T.O leadership abroad. Theodore Roos had died in 1923, and Crowley claimed that Roos had named him in the next world head of the O.T.O. Very convenient. This claim was disputed by the German O.T.O leader Heinrich Tranke and others, who convened a meeting in 1925 to sort out leadership. Crowley attended this Veda conference in Hohenlieben, Thuringia. The gathering was dramatic. Some German members, like Martha Kunzel and Karl Germer, sided with Crowley wholeheartedly, impressed by his spiritual presence and Thelemic teachings. Others, like the artist Alban Grau and the mystic Henry Bierven, rejected Crowley's claim and approach, finding him too authoritarian or just too deviant for their taste. The conference ended with O.T.O fragmenting. Crowley walked away with a few loyal adherents, but much of the German membership drifted off. Crowley's influence was ironically stronger in places like England and North America now than in Central Europe, where his new religion and focus on sex magic did not entirely sit well with the more traditional occultists. After the conference, Crowley settled down again in Paris in 1926–27. He had a series of lovers, male and female, and short-term scarlet women. He continued the magical experiments, sometimes with paid partners, writing down the results in coded diaries. But this high life was undercut by his health and finances. He was continuously using heroin and cocaine, which is expensive, oscillating between periods of relative sobriety and periods of binge. His mood swings were pronounced. Friends noted how he could be charming one moment and venomous the next if withdrawal pangs hit, or if he felt slighted in some way. Yet in this decline, Crowley managed intellectual feats. In 1928, he finished and published Magick in Theory and Practice, which was essentially part 3 of Book 4, a dense magical manual of philosophy and technique that distilled his 2 decades of experience. This book was one of his masterpieces, covering everything from fundamental principles to detailed instructions for rituals and talismans, to candid admissions about the use of sex and drugs in magic. It didn't make a big splash in sales. Nothing of Crowley's did at that time, but it does stand today as one of his most systematic works, During these Paris years, Crowley gathered a small coterie of young Englishmen who helped him with publishing and finances. Israel Regardie, a 21-year-old occult enthusiast, became Crowley's secretary in 1928. He typed Crowley's manuscripts, observed his rituals, and learned at the feet of the master for 2 years. He left on friendly terms in 1930 and became a prominent occult author himself, writing with mixed feelings about his time with Crowley. Another was Gerald York, a well-connected ex-military man who, while never a convert to Thelema, admired Crowley's knowledge. York helped manage Crowley's chaotic accounts and negotiated with publishers on his behalf. York would later preserve many of Crowley's papers, performing a great service to posterity, even though he remained personally skeptical of Crowley's more lofty claims. And Tom Drieberg, an ambitious young journalist and later a British MP, also fraternized with Crowley around 1929. Though Drieberg did not embrace Thelema, he certainly enjoyed Crowley's wit and rebellious flair, and he too later helped salvage Crowley's literary remains. Now, in 1929, Crowley entered into another marriage, but this time it was more about convenience, with one Maria Teresa Ferrari de Miramar, a Nicaraguan woman that he had met in Paris. The reasons were likely pragmatic. Crowley thought a marriage might help him avoid deportation from France. French authorities were starting to eye this notorious Englishman with suspicion, partly thanks to British pressure. Additionally, Maria Teresa had a small income that might support them. The marriage did not bring happiness. Maria Teresa found herself bewildered by Crowley's habits and soon fell into alcoholism and mental illness. Within a couple of years, she, too, was institutionalized, marking another personal failure in Crowley's ledger. But Crowley did not divorce her, but he did effectively abandon the relationship, rather. Around the same time, Crowley finally succeeded in getting some of his major writings published, albeit in limited editions. With the help of a new British publishing house, Mandrake Press, he published the Confessions of Aleister Crowley in 1929 to 1930, but only the first few sections, 6 chapters in 2 volumes, before Mandrake went bust. Bad luck, I suppose. He also published a novel, Moonchild, a fantastical story about rival magicians vying over the birth of a supernatural child, drawing on his experiences with the Golden Dawn and Thelema. Moonchild was published in 1929, and while it didn't sell in large numbers, it has remained in print as a curious piece of occult fiction that reveals Crowley's ideas in narrative form. Another book of short stories, The Stratagem, came out, showing his versatility as a writer. But despite these creative outputs, Crowley was effectively living hand to mouth by 1930. When Mandrake Press folded and the Confessions remained incomplete, to his frustration, Crowley was left with crates of unsold books and mounting debts. It was then that he orchestrated one of his more theatrical stunts, the fake taking of his own life at Portugal's Boca de Inferno, the mouth of hell. September 1930, Crowley visited Lisbon and befriended the poet Fernanda Pessoa, a fellow mystic of sorts. Crowley left a hat, a coat, and a very cryptic note at the cliff, and then slipped away secretly to Germany, trying to make it look like he had jumped off. Newspapers reported him missing, possibly dead, but a few weeks later he turned up alive at an art exhibition of his paintings in Berlin. The whole thing was a publicity stunt, meant to stir intrigue around his persona, and possibly to escape creditors temporarily. The press got the joke, some deriding him more, but Crowley seemed delighted by the minor sensation. The art exhibition in Berlin itself had some success. People found his expressionist paintings to be interesting, if dark and primitive. Berlin in the Weimar era was a city where Crowley's eccentricity fit in quite well. He found the nightlife and liberal atmosphere to be quite invigorating. In Berlin, Crowley socialized with artists and even psychologists, meeting with figures like Aldous Huxley and Alfred Adler, and as earlier noted. He lived cheaply, too, moved in with a couple of admirers, and continued writing. But politics was shifting. Germany was changing. And Crowley, though initially curious about the pagan pageantry of the new National Socialist Party, would soon see them as brutes, besides the fact that as a, quote, degenerate occultist with rumored Jewish associations via his students, he would have been quite unwelcome had he stayed. By 1932, he returned to London, hoping to rehabilitate his standing somewhat. It was a forlorn hope. He engaged in sensational litigation, famously suing the sculptor Nina Hamnet, whose memoir had implied Crowley practiced black magic. The trial in 1934, however, was a disaster for him. The defense attorney dredged up all of Crowley's worst press, quoting his poetry, the most obscene lines, and every nasty epithet that the newspapers had printed. The judge, Justice Swift, I know, right? That's probably the greatest name for a judge that I've ever heard, was openly appalled, making the oft-quoted statement that he had never heard such dreadful, horrible, blasphemous talk as that was done by Crowley, who calls himself the greatest living poet, a line that actually drew laughter in court. Crowley lost the case, leaving him with crushing legal costs. In short order, he was forced into bankruptcy. The proceedings of the bankruptcy hearing revealed that Crowley had been living way beyond his means for years, borrowing and incurring debts that he could never pay. By the mid-1930s, Crowley effectively was a broken man in the eyes of the public. But privately, he still had work to do. He managed to publish one last major magical work in 1936, The Equinox of the Gods, which presented the text of the Book of the Law alongside with Crowley's own account of how it was received in 1904 and its significance. Interestingly, The Equinox of the Gods sold relatively well for an occult book, showing that there was a growing segment of the public who were interested in Crowley's ideas, even as mainstream society was shunning him. Perhaps that was why they were interested. Well, Crowley also found an unlikely domestic happiness of sorts in the 30s. He continued to hold small gatherings, curry dinners where he impressed guests with his excellent Indian cooking, all extremely spicy, by the way, and maintained correspondence with Thelemites abroad, especially in America, where an O.T.O. lodge, Agape Lodge in California under Wilfred Smith, was still blossoming. And in 1937, something remarkable happened. At the age of 61, Crowley became a father again. A young woman named Deirdre McAlpine, who admired Crowley's philosophy, offered to bear him an heir. And she did. A son was born, named Randall Gare Crowley, but nicknamed Aleister Ataturk, Crowley's humor combining his own name with that of Turkey's modern founder. Crowley was reportedly delighted by the child's birth, although he did not play a major role in raising the boy. Crowley took it as a personal vindication that he could still be generative in later life. By 1938-39, as the Second World War loomed, Crowley's life in London was quiet and scholarly. He gave a few public lectures on yoga in Soho, which were modestly attended. At least they helped reposition him as something as an eccentric older statesman of mysticism, rather than a satanic villain. The press had mostly lost interest, as newer horrors and scandals emerged in the world stage, Crowley, as the perennial anti-hero, had outlived many of his detractors and was mellowing out with age, though not entirely. He still wrote vitriolic letters and critiques, once reviewing a negative biography about him by ex-disciple Rigardi with scathing wit. But financially, he survived by the generosity of devotees. The Agate Lodge in California regularly sent him money, from dues of members like Parsons mainly. Friends like Gerard York occasionally slipped him funds discreetly. Karl Germer, who had been imprisoned by the Germans in 1935 for mailings related to the O.T.O, and then emigrated to the U.S., also managed Crowley's affairs from afar and supported him where he could. But as war dawned, again in 1939, Crowley was an old man, witnessing a world conflagration he had predicted in some of his astrological writings. As the bombs fell on London in the Blitz, Crowley left the city for safety in rural Torquay in 1940, though he found that town dull and hostile to an outsider. So eventually he returned to London, preferring the risk to the boredom. His last great enterprise was the Thoth Tarot deck. Starting in 1942 in collaboration with artist Lady Frida Harris, Crowley supervised the design of a full tarot set embodying Thelemic and Golden Dawn symbolism at a high level of detail and beauty. The project was an artistic triumph. The paintings were exquisite, and Crowley wrote a companion volume, The Book of Thoth, published in 1944, explaining the deck. This work was effectively his swan song in occult literature. Erudite, deeply esoteric, but also accessible to serious students of tarot. Today, the Thoth Tarot is one of the most popular and respected tarot decks in the world, a lasting practical legacy of Crowley's esoteric knowledge. By the mid-1940s, his health was on an irreversible decline. He had chronic bronchitis and emphysema. Heroin remained the only things that eased his asthma, so he couldn't quit it entirely, even if he wanted to. In 1945, after the war ended, Crowley moved to a boarding house near Netherwood in Hastings, a quiet seaside town. It was a gracious if modest place, run by an eccentric couple who didn't mind taking in the infamous magician as long as he paid his rent. Here, Crowley spent his final years in relative peace. He had a small circle of visitors. Kenneth Grant, a young acolyte who became his secretary, and whom Crowley groomed to be a future occult leader. Grant indeed went on to found his own branch of Crowleyan occultism after Crowley's death. There was also John Simmons, a writer who befriended Crowley in these years, who would later become one of his literary executors, and biographers, though not always a flattering one. And of course always a steady stream of pilgrims from the Thelemic community. Crowley continued writing almost to the end. One of his late initiatives was compiling letters of advice to his O.T.O students into a book. This was published posthumously as Magick Without Tears. The letters date from 43 to 44, a collection that shows Crowley at his most explanatory, answering questions about magical training without the usual satire that he sometimes employed. And so, December 1st, 1947, Aleister Crowley died at the age of 72. The cause was given as chronic bronchitis, aggravated by pleurisy and myocardial degeneration. Basically put, his lungs and heart gave up after years of strain. According to one nurse's account, his last words were, "I am perplexed," an oddly poignant and humble phrase if true, suggesting perhaps at the threshold of death, even the great Magus confronted mystery. Another anecdote claims that he said, "Sometimes I hate myself reflecting a final moment of clarity or regret. It's hard to know. Deathbed quotes like that pretty much get romanticized more often than not. A small funeral was held at Brighton Crematorium. About a dozen people attended, including his son, Aleister Ataturk, still a child, and a few loyal friends. Louis Wilkinson, a fellow occultist and literary friend, read selections from Crowley's works as part of the ceremony. He recited Hymn to Pan and passages from the Book of the Law in the Gnostic Mass. The press, ever alert to sensation, got wind of this and lambasted the event as a black mass in the newspapers, sparking one last burst of outrage. But at that point, Crowley was certainly beyond caring, and his handful of devotees were content to send him off in a way that he would have approved. Crowley's body was cremated, and eventually the ashes were sent to Carl Germer in America. Germer buried Crowley's remains in his own garden in New Jersey, just as one might plant a seed. Well, I suppose that's where we ended. Aleister Crowley is dead. And the video has ended. It's been a long one, I know, but it's been highly requested that I do Aleister Crowley, a life of him. And, well, a figure that's so divisive and interesting certainly demands a long biography. Now, let me thank the patrons and YouTube supporters. The reason why there was no ads, because their kind support is at the top tier ones. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Mountaineer, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Brandon, Lucy, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mom? Okay, that's it for me for now. We certainly had a good time, didn't we? If you've listened to the end, you have to leave a comment, you really do. Because not many people do listen to the end. Most fall asleep, or something like that, so you really should leave your thoughts on Aleister Crowley, since you've learned so much in our almost 2.5 hours together. But as for me, I think I'm going for a well-deserved rest now. So I bid you adieu. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all, and I will see you when you feel like returning. You know where I'll be, right here on YouTube. Good night, and farewell.